Good morning to you all and welcome to this presentation. In my presentation, I'm going to look at sampling methods. However, I'm going to focus on non-random sampling. To begin with, it is very important for a postgraduate student to understand the sampling terminologies so that when you are writing your research proposal, dissertation, or thesis, you are able to use the sampling terminologies correctly. What is sampling? A sampling is a process of selecting a small portion or part of the population to represent the entire target or entire population. So when you engage in that process of selecting a group of people or units from which data is going to be collected, you are sampling the population. Now, what is the population? A population is the entire collection of units, an entire aggregation of people in a given area the study is going to be conducted. If you are going to conduct your study at the University of KwaZulu-Natal among students, then the entire body of students is your population. What is a target population? Target population is the entire aggregation or collection of units or people a researcher is interested in. If you are going to conduct your study at the University of KwaZulu-Natal among students, however, you are not interested in the entire population, you are interested in postgraduate students, then postgraduate students, the body of postgraduate students, is your target population. Sampling frame. What is a sampling frame? A sampling frame is a list of all the units or people in a population from which a sample is going to be collected or drawn. When you put together the list of all the people, all the postgraduate students, then that is your sampling frame because your data is going to be collected from there as you are going to select your sample from the sampling frame. What is a sample? A sample is a subset or subgroup of the entire population selected to participate in the study. It is a collection of all the units that have been included in the study or that will provide the data the researcher needs. And what is a unit? And I'll be using this term a number of times in this presentation. A unit is a basic element or a person in a sample or population. If you choose me, you choose given to be part of your sample, to be part of the people who are going to provide the data, then I am a unit to you, an element. Sampling bias. We talk about sampling bias when we are writing our research proposals, our dissertations, and theses. Sampling bias is the over or underrepresentation of a group of the population in terms of characteristics needed. For example, if you want to conduct a study among students to understand the underlying factors to intimate partner violence, and then you select, and according to literature, indicates that males or male students are the perpetrators of intimate partner violence. Now, in your sample, you select 90% to be females, and then 10% to be males. there is an underrepresentation of males who are needed to be part of the study, because you are interested in the features, in the characteristics of the people who are the main perpetrators of the problem that you are investigating. There is also an underrepresentation of the characteristics that may not be so important in your study. So when there is an under or overrepresentation of a group or characteristics needed in the study, you have committed a sampling bias. Sample size. Oh, I'm conducting my study and my sample size is 100, is 200. What do you mean? A sample size is the total number of units or people selected to participate in your study. If you're going to collect your data from 100 people, your sample size is 100. Sampling error. This is the difference between the population value and sample value. What does this mean? Is the failure of the sample, the units you have selected to participate in the study, to represent or reflect the entire population. That is to say, the characteristics that you have in the sample do not reflect the entire population. Therefore, you have committed a sampling error. A sampling error can be committed because of the sampling bias, overrepresentation or underrepresentation. Parameters. Parameters are the entire characteristics of the population you are studying. If your population is made up of blacks, Indians, coloreds, whites, Christians, first years, second years, those are the parameters of your population. If you look at the diagram, the green part is your population. Let's say the green part is the University of KwaZulu-Natal students. And when you look at the green part, there are some maroon boxes. Those are the units, and the maroon boxes are found in the population, in the target population, in the sampling frame, and in the sample. So the entire collection of the students is your population. But as I said earlier, you are only interested in the postgraduate students. That is your target population. And when you look at the target population, inside is the white box. That is the sampling frame, the list of all the units or people you are interested in. And from that sampling frame, there's an oval shape which is yellow in color. That is your sample, the group you have selected for inclusion in the study from which data is going to be collected. So it's very important as a postgraduate student, as you write in your research proposal, your dissertation, or your thesis, you are very clear with these terminologies. Now let us come to the sampling methods. There are two categories of sampling methods: probability and non-probability sampling. In this presentation, I'm not going to focus on probability because probability sampling is more quantitative. I will therefore focus on non-probability sampling. But for us to be able to understand non-probability sampling, then I'm going to briefly outline what probability sampling is. Because if there is non-probability sampling, then there must be probability sampling. Probability sampling is also called random or quantitative sampling. In this sampling method, units or people are selected by chance or probability. That is to say, probability sampling is guided by the principle of random selection. And this is the heart of probability sampling. The researcher begins by establishing the sampling frame. You remember how we defined the sampling frame? A list of all the units in the target population from which a sample is selected. All the units in the population have a chance of inclusion in the sample. They do not only have a chance, and this is very important, they have an equal chance of participating in the study or becoming part of the sample. And that is the principle of random selection that makes the population to be viewed or dealt that way. In probability sampling, the units or the people, they know their chance of participating in the study because of the principle of random selection. There are very important features that we need to take into consideration when we are looking at probability sampling. First, it uses rigorous rules and procedures. There are very clear do's and don'ts. If you do this, you'll be able to generate a sample that reflects the entire population. If you don't do this, you will generate a sample that is not able to represent the entire population, or you will commit sampling bias or sampling error. Very clear rules and procedures. Probability sampling reduces bias, as I said, the proneness to over or underrepresent some characteristics needed in the study. Probability sampling enhances accuracy or precision. A researcher is able to generate a sample that reflects the population. Results of probability sampling, as other presenters have said, they can be generalized to the target population. Probability sampling deals with large samples. It is very demanding in terms of resources. You need enough time, enough resources, enough or appropriate knowledge for you to be able to implement the probability sampling process. You need skills. You need special knowledge to be able to translate the principles, the information into a sampling or a probability sampling process. Probability sampling is good for systematic empirical studies. Studies whose objective is to quantify or measure data. If your research is going to measure or quantify data, then probability sampling is your method to use. Let me now come to non-probability sampling, the gist of my presentation. Non-probability sampling is also called judgment or non-random or qualitative sampling method. Units or people are selected based on the judgment of the researcher. And this is very important for us to understand because it is the heart of non-probability sampling. Inclusion in the sample is based on the judgment of the researcher. You can get into the sleeping mode as I'm presenting. But when you wake up, if you are able to say non-probability sampling is based on the judgment of the researcher, I have no problems with you getting into the mode sleep. Because this judgment of the researcher is the heart of non-probability sampling. But when we say it's dependent on the judgment of the researcher, we are not saying it's a chaotic, a slapdash, a confused sampling method. No. We are not saying it is at the discretion or the researcher has the right to defoul the principles of sampling. No. The judgment of the researcher is reliably and credibly informed. The judgment of the researcher or the faculty of the researcher is informed by one, theory. The faculty the judgment of the researcher is informed by knowledge that has been tested on how to sample a population. Here I'm talking about reliable and credible academic information, academic rules, concepts on how to sample the population. Second, the judgment of the researcher is informed by practice. The researcher has skills and experience on how to sample the population. These are the elements that inform the judgment of the researcher. Third, the judgment of the researcher is informed by the evolutionary nature of research. That is to say, the researcher is conscious of what is happening in the research communities. He is aware of the new knowledge and uses that knowledge to inform him or guide him as he's judging the units to include or the people to include in the sample. Since non-probability sampling is dependent on the judgment of the researcher, selection is dependent on the judgment of the researcher. Therefore, selection is by choice, not chance. Selection is by judgment, not the principle of random selection. There are no equal chances given to the units to be selected or included in the sample. Non-probability sampling is good for exploratory studies. Studies whose objective is to investigate the phenomenon, a phenomenon that is not known or clearly known. It allows the researcher to select units or people that will provide the researcher with the information needed to be able to understand the phenomenon or gain insight into the phenomenon under study. Usability of non-probability sampling. Rules and procedures are easier to implement. You don't need advanced knowledge or skills to implement probability sampling. It deals with small samples. You can conduct your study and a non-probability study with one person or one unit. And you'll be able to realize the data that you want. 10 people, 20 people, very small samples. It is time-saving and cheaper. Now, let me quickly relate the features of non-probability sampling to probability sampling. Probability sampling is informed by mathematical theory. That is to say, it is guided by rigorous rules and procedures. Non-probability is guided by judgmental theory. Probability sampling, selection is by chance, or rather, the process is guided by the principle of random selection. While non-probability sampling, selection is guided by the principle of judgment. Probability sampling uses a detailed sampling frame. You first need a list of all the units in the target population for you to be able to implement probability sampling. When it comes to non-probability sampling, it works without a sampling frame. You don't need first to create a list of all the units or people. You can start with one person available and then continue to assemble your study sample. Probability sampling gives an equal chance to all the units, while non-probability sampling, inclusion in the sample is dependent on the judgment of the researcher. Probability sampling allows the researcher to generate a representative sample, a sample that reflects the entire population in terms of characteristics. While non-probability sampling does not generate a representative sample, instead generates a reliable sample from which data is going to be collected. Probability sampling results can be generalized to the population, while non-probability sampling is not after generalizing the results to the population, but making the researcher to have insight into the population or the phenomenon under study. Probability sampling needs a lot of resources. You need enough time, enough finances, enough skills, and enough knowledge. While non-probability sampling, you can do with the little resources that you have, depending on the circumstance of your research. Probability sampling deals with large samples, while non-probability sampling deals with small samples. It is academically wrong to say, since probability sampling uses rigorous rules and procedures and produces a sample that reflects the entire population, therefore probability sampling is superior to non-probability sampling. It is academically wrong because these two sampling methods have different natures. They have different purposes. They have different objectives. Therefore, they are not diametric opposition. They are not antagonistic. They are not in the research field as competitors. They complement each other. They support each other. They overlap each other. Therefore, when non-probability sampling and probability sampling meet, the field is not a battlefield. It's a resolution field, a complementary field where they overlap, where they support or complement each other. Non-probability sampling. Now, I want to get into the intricacies of the techniques that are used to conduct non-probability sampling. The first one is snowball sampling. Inclusion in the sample depends on the judgment of the researcher. In this sampling technique, units or people are selected using recommendations by area units or people. How does it work? First, the researcher can identify an initial person or persons in the desired population. Then the researcher asks the initial person to recommend other people with the characteristics needed to be included in the sample. Third, the researcher continues to assemble units using recommendations of the area units until the researcher has the sample size desired. Usability of snowball sampling. It allows the researcher to gain access to populations that are hard to reach. Imagine, or take for example, if I was to conduct a study on students, sex workers. If I'm from the quantitative paradigm, as I said, I will need a sampling frame, a list of all the units or people in the target population. Where am I going to get the sampling frame for student sex workers? I can go to DMI or to the office of the vice chancellor. They will not give me the sampling frame. Not because of ethical reasons. There is no such a sampling frame. Now, if you have been funded, you have been given money by the Department of Education to conduct the study on student sex workers, you go back to the department and say, thank you for the 3 million you had given us to conduct the study. But we are sorry, here is the money, because we cannot establish a sampling frame. So maybe you can